Chapter 1. The Boy from Lockfield. The sun rose slowly over the rolling green fields of Lockfield, a small farming area nestled deep within Ayrshire, Scotland. The land breathed history, the kind of quiet, persistent history, not written in books, but sown into soil, whispered by stone walls, and carried in the rhythm of cows returning to barn at dusk. In this remote pastoral world, on the 6th of August, 1881, Alexander Fleming was born into a modest Scottish farming family. He was the 7th of 8 children, and life on the farm was simple hard but honest. His father, Hugh Fleming, was a man of the earth. Gray-bearded and soft-spoken, he worked the land with slow certainty. He had already fathered children from a previous marriage and was over 60 when Alexander was born. His mother, Grace Morton, came from Highland, stock-stern but kind-hearted, a woman with quick eyes and sharper instincts. Though not wealthy, the family lived comfortably within the boundaries of farm life, tending sheep, growing potatoes, braving winters, and praying for good harvests. There were no expectations of greatness, only decency, survival, and respect for the land. From a young age, Alecus, everyone called him, was different. He was quiet, observant, and oddly patient for a child. While his brothers wrestled in the fields, Alec often watched the patterns of birds in the sky, the way water ran through mossy creek beds, or how frost crystals formed like lace on window panes. No one in Lockfield thought the little boy watching puddles shimmer in the sun would one day help save the world. The Fleming family household was one of order, but not rigidity. The children were expected to rise with the sun, complete their chores, and assist in whatever task was at hand, be it feeding livestock, mending fences, or turning soil. In the evenings, when the fire crackled softly and the scent of peat smoke filled the air, the family would gather. Conversations were sparse but warm. Alec listened more than he spoke. Though the family was not wealthy, they were rich in something else, education and curiosity. Grace Morton, though raised in the Highlands where traditional roles often kept women from intellectual pursuits, believed deeply in the value of schooling for all her children. Even amidst the rugged life of farming, she kept a small shelf of books dog-eared, faded, but read often. Among those books, young Alec found an early fascination with the natural sciences. He was especially drawn to tales of explorers, naturalists, and great thinkers who had changed the world not with swords, but with questions. Though he didn't yet know what a bacterium was, the seed of his future had been sown. By age 5, he was enrolled in Loudon Moor School, a modest village schoolhouse with wooden desks and coal stoves. The teacher, Mr. McRae, remembered Alec as quiet but watchful, with a persistence in solving puzzles that made other boys impatient. When he moved on to Darvel School, his academic performance was so strong that he skipped grades and caught the attention of his instructors. His particular interest in mathematics and geometry led one teacher to suggest he might one day become an engineer, but Alec himself didn't yet know what path to follow. The world was still wide open. Then came tragedy. In 1888, when Alec was just 7 years old, his father, Hugh Fleming, died suddenly. The family was shaken. Hugh had been the backbone of the farm, and without him, much of the burden fell on the older sons. But the hardship brought the siblings closer together. Among them was Thomas Fleming, the eldest brother, who had left Lockfield years earlier and become a successful physician in London. He visited the family during holidays and carried with him a certain air of urban sophistication that intrigued young Alec. Unlike the hard work of farming, Thomas sped science, hospitals, and life in the city. It made an impression. Alec, though still a boy, began to imagine a world beyond Ayrshire, a world where the invisible things, germs, diseases, caress mattered just as much as the visible one. Still, it would be years before he left the farm behind. A young mind awakens. At age 13, Alexander left rural life and moved to London to live with his brother Thomas. It was the first time he had ever seen the immensity of the city the endless rows of brick buildings, the clatter of horseshoes on cobblestone, and the dense crowds of people from every walk of life. He enrolled at Regent Street Polytechnic School, where he excelled in sciences and mathematics. But money was tight. Rather than immediately pursue university, he worked for several years at a shipping company called American Line. His job was uneventful, dealing with clerical records and mail. But even in that quiet office job, Alec was still observing, still thinking. He read widely. On lunch breaks, he would visit libraries or take long walks, sometimes studying the patterns of city pigeons or watching the Thames. It was during this time that fate intervened again. His brother Thomas, now a well-respected physician, recognized Alec's intellectual potential. He encouraged him to apply to medical school and even offered to pay for his tuition. It was an extraordinary gesture. In 1901, at the age of 20, Alexander enrolled at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington. No one could have predicted that the young Scotsman walking into the hospital gates that day would one day discover a substance that would save more human lives than any single weapon ever invented. The birth of a scientist. At St. Mary's, Fleming quickly distinguished himself. Though not particularly social or talkative, he had an uncanny ability to absorb information and apply it practically. He performed exceptionally in anatomy, physiology, and especially bacteriology, which at the time was an emerging field still mired in trial and error. One of his professors noted, "Fleming has an unusual gift that sees things others ignore." He had intended to become a surgeon, but his excellence in natural science earned him a scholarship that guided him instead toward laboratory research. This redirection would change everything. By 1906, Fleming qualified as a physician and joined the inoculation department under the direction of Sir Almroth Wright, a brilliant and sometimes controversial pioneer in vaccine research. Wright was not just a mentor, he was a challenger of orthodoxy, a man who demanded his students question every assumption. Fleming thrived under him. It was under Wright's tutelage that Fleming learned how to culture bacteria, test serums, and track microbial resistance. His curiosity deepened. He was fascinated by how something invisible could kill a human, and even more fascinated by how it could be stopped. Though Fleming's outward appearance was unremarkable, he often wore the same worn lab coat and kept an untidy desk. His mind was razor sharp. He worked long hours, even on weekends. Often, colleagues found him asleep in the lab chair, with open notebooks still in his hands. Seeds of greatness. Outside the lab, Fleming was a man of few words, but a sharp wit. His humor was dry, often delivered without expression. He painted in watercolors as a hobby and rarely attended social functions. But he was known for loyalty to his colleagues, a commitment to truth, and a personal code of humility that kept him grounded even as his reputation grew. As the first decade of the 20th century came to a close, Fleming had begun building a quiet, stable career in research. He was respected within his department, published occasionally in academic journals, and taught classes to younger students. But he had not yet changed the world. Not yet. That moment was coming, though he had no way of knowing it. In the years to come, the world would descend into global war, and in the trenches of France, Fleming would witness horrors that would rewire his scientific priorities forever. The gentle, curious boy from Lockfield was about to become a man of war, of medicine, and of microbial revolution. But first there was a battlefield to cross. Chapter 2, London Calling, Early Medical Ambitions. London in 1901 was a city of contradictions. Beneath its imperial grandeur and technological pride, the trams, the gas lights, the steamship sleigh, soot-filled skies, choking alleys, and a medical system still grappling with the invisible world of infection. It was into this environment that Alexander Fleming, a soft-spoken 20-year-old from rural Scotland, arrived as a student at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington. His decision to study medicine had come as a surprise to many. After all, he had spent years working a shipping job, but something had awakened in him desire not just to observe the world, but to understand its hidden mechanisms, to fight the unseen threats within the human body. At St. Mary's, Fleming entered a world of gas-lit lecture halls, white aprons, and anatomical models. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and ink. Professors spoke in Latin-tinged English. Students learned by watching, memorizing, repeating. But where most of his classmates focused on rote learning, Fleming remained deeply inquisitive. His notebooks were not just filled with copied diagrams, but also with sketches, annotations, and hypotheses. Even then, his mind worked laterally, searching for exceptions, patterns, and subtle clues that others missed. He was not a charismatic student. He wasn't a top speaker or a charming networker, but in the lab, his talent was unmistakable. His professors began to take note. A scholar in the shadows. In 1906, Fleming graduated near the top of his class and was awarded the 1,908 gold medal in bacteriology for outstanding performance. It was not only a prize, it was a door. He was offered a permanent position in the inoculation department at St. Mary's under the mentorship of Sir Almroth Wright, a pioneering immunologist and early advocate of vaccine therapy. Wright was, in many ways, the opposite of Fleming: outspoken, argumentative, and prone to long-winded lectures. But the two formed an unusual and effective partnership. Wright believed medicine had become too arrogant, too reliant on cures instead of prevention. He drilled into his students the importance of understanding the immune system, of listening to the body's natural defenses, and of using science to amplify, not override, those systems. Fleming absorbed these ideas like sponge to liquid. Under Wright's guidance, he began to conduct experiments on white blood cells, blood serum reactions, and the behavior of bacteria in varying conditions. He learned how to culture pathogens, how to measure immune responses, and most importantly, how to wait. Good science required patience and precision, two things he had in abundance. His lab bench, however, told a different story. It was chaotic clutter of unwashed test tubes, half-labeled dishes, and moldy cultures. His colleagues often laughed at the mess, but somehow Fleming always knew where everything was. There was a method to his madness, one lab assistant later recalled. What looked like chaos to us was actually a system of quiet observation. He noticed things none of us did, and that habit noticing would one day change the world. First love, first lessons. Outside the lab, Fleming's life was modest. He lived in small, rented quarters, walked to work, and spent most evenings reading scientific journals or painting watercolor landscapes. Few knew he had an artistic side. Fewer still knew how deeply he valued solitude. But in 1915, that solitude was interrupted by love. He met and married Sarah Marion McElroy, an Irish nurse who worked at St. Mary's, Tomplains. She was warm, articulate, and had a passion for helping others, qualities that balanced Alexander's introspective nature. Their bond was quiet but strong. Their marriage gave him a greater sense of stability. He no longer worked only for science. He worked for the future, for the idea of a world less vulnerable to illness, for the patients that Sarah so often spoke about from the hospital wards. And then, war erupted. The First World War calls. In 1914, as World War I began sweeping through Europe, Fleming, like many in the medical field, enlisted. He joined the Royal Army Medical Corps and was deployed to field hospitals in France. Nothing in his previous training had prepared him for the horrors of war. The trenches were more than battlegrounds. They were petri dishes of infection. Soldiers arrived with limbs torn apart by shrapnel, their wounds crawling with gangrene, tetanus, and sepsis. The standard treatment involved dousing wounds in antiseptics like carbolic acid or hydrogen peroxide. But Fleming noticed something horrifying. The more antiseptics used, the worse some patients became. It didn't make sense. He began to study the wounds and discovered that antiseptics were killing not just the bacteria but also the body's white blood cells, the very agents trying to fight the infection. His reports were initially dismissed as heretical. After all, antiseptics were the foundation of battlefield medicine. But Fleming had data, and he had evidence. Slowly, some began to listen. He returned to St. Mary's in 1918 with a fire in his heart. The war had not broken him, it had sharpened his purpose. He now understood that the enemy wasn't just bacteriate, was also our ignorance of how to defeat it without harming the body. He dedicated himself to finding a gentler weapon, something that could kill microbes but leave human cells untouched. And so, in the post-war silence, he returned to his lab and began again, laying the groundwork. Back in London, Fleming resumed his research under Wright, but he was no longer just a junior assistant. He had proven his ability in the war, and he was beginning to be seen as a serious thinker in bacteriological circles. His focus turned increasingly toward the body's own antimicrobial defenses, inspired in part by what he had seen in the trenches. He began examining saliva, mucus, blood, and tears, wondering whether these fluids contained natural substances that could fight infection. This line of inquiry would eventually lead to his first great discovery, lysozyme, the enzyme that hinted at a biochemical immune system hidden within the human body. But that moment had not yet come. For now, Fleming continued his daily ritual sculpturing bacteria, labeling slides, scribbling notes, and occasionally sneezing near petri dishes. And somewhere in the back of his mind a thought stirred. There must be a way to kill bacteria without killing the patient. It was not a grand mission. It wasn't even clear yet. But it was enough. Enough to keep him looking. Enough to keep him waiting. Enough to one day see what others would have thrown away. Chapter 3. Battlefields and Bacteria. Lessons from War. The summer of 1914 saw the world unravel at terrifying speed. What began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand quickly spiraled into an all-consuming global conflict, World War I. By August, Europe was engulfed in trenches, wire, and fire. The British Empire, along with its colonies and allies, was mobilizing troops and resources on a scale never seen before. Amidst the swelling tide of volunteers, Alexander Fleming was not a soldier with a rifle, but he had no less a role to play. He joined the Royal Army Medical Corps as a captain in the medical services, assigned to military field hospitals in France. His responsibility to tend to the wounded, the dying, the infected, to confront bacteria not as a curious academic subject, but as a deadly, real-time adversary. And he would never be the same again. The real enemy? In the mud-soaked trenches of northern France, Fleming found himself surrounded by suffering. Shell blasts, bayonet wounds, gas-burn siege trauma was only the beginning. Within hours or days, even seemingly minor injuries became fatal. The true killer wasn't always the wound. It was what followed: gas gangrene, a horrific bacterial infection that caused flesh to rot within hours. Sepsis, turning blood into poison. Tetanus, locking jaws and spazzing muscles into death. Staphylococcus and streptococcus, infecting bullet wounds and burns with brutal speed. Doctors and nurses worked desperately to clean and treat injuries. The common method involved liberal application of antiseptic chemical solutions believed to kill bacteria. Carbolic acid, iodine, hydrogen, peroxidile, poured into open wounds in an effort to cleanse them. But Fleming watched with growing horror as many of his patients got worse, not better. He noticed a disturbing pattern. Wounds treated with strong antiseptics often festered. Those flushed with salt water or left alone sometimes healed. Something was wrong. Could it be that the tools doctors trusted were doing harm? A dangerous hypothesis. Fleming began to quietly collect evidence. He examined pus samples from wounds, measured bacterial counts, and compared treatment outcomes. Again and again, the data confirmed what he suspected. The antiseptics didn't discriminate. They were killing the good, with the bad destroying the body's own immune cells, especially the white blood cells vital to healing. Instead of helping, they were leaving the wound defenseless, opening the door for even more virulent infections. This theory went against accepted military medical doctrine. Surgeons had long relied on antiseptics. Florence Nightingale's reforms decades earlier had popularized their use. Suggesting they were counterproductive was nearly heretical. But Fleming was not concerned with reputations, he was concerned with truth. He published his findings in military medical bulletins, and though many dismissed them, a small group of progressive doctors took notice. Some began reducing the use of harsh antiseptics, instead flushing wounds with sterile saline and observing the results. And the results were promising. Though change was slow, Fleming had done something revolutionary, not in discovering a cure, but in challenging blind tradition with observation, reason, and courage. A scientist in the trenches. Amid the chaos of war, Fleming never lost his inner scientist. When not treating soldiers, he sketched bacterial growths in field notebooks. He tested the effectiveness of different wound cleaning techniques, often culturing samples on makeshift equipment. In the mud and blood, among gunshots and groans, he was studying, learning. It was during this time that his sense of purpose solidified. He saw that many soldiers died not from the initial injury, but from secondary infectiona, microscopic invasion that crept in silently, invisibly, and with devastating consequences. And worst of all, no one had a reliable weapon against it. Morphine dulled the pain, surgery removed the limb, but what killed the infection? Nothing. This became his obsession. He returned to England in 1918, just after the armistice, with a wound in his mind, a wound filled with memories of men he could not save, and a singular question echoing louder than ever: is there a way to kill bacteria without killing the patient? Back to the lab, changed forever. When Fleming walked through the doors of St. Mary's Hospital again, he was not the same man. He brought back a soldier's silence, a survivor's grit, and a scientist's rage against ignorance. He resumed his work under Sir Almroth Wright, but his focus was now sharpened to a blade's edge. He turned again to the body's natural responses. He recalled how some wounds healed better with simple cleansing. He thought about how the immune system might already contain weapons, not white blood cells alone, but perhaps chemical agents in fluids like saliva, tears, and mucus. This was not idle speculation. It was the genesis of his next breakthrough, one that would come not from a battlefield, but from a common cold and a sneeze into a petri dish. But that story belonged to the next chapter. For now, Alexander Fleming had returned from war with a quiet vow: I will not let infection win. There must be a better way. Chapter Steret. The Lysosome Revelation. It began with a sneeze. In the winter of 1922, Alexander Fleming sat at his desk at St. Mary's Hospital in London, nursing a mild cold. He wiped his nose, dabbed at watery eyes, and continued setting up his bacterial cultures as he had done 100 times before. Some mucus-clear, ordinary human mucus landed on a petri dish already containing a culture of Staphylococcus bacteria. Fleming paused, not because he expected anything, but because, by instinct, he never ignored a change in routine. Most scientists would have discarded the dish and started again. Fleming, instead, left it untouched and watched. Several days later, when he returned to the dish, he saw something unusual. The bacterial growth around the mucus had dissolved. Not just receded or slowed it, had completely vanished in that zone. It wasn't a fluke, it wasn't luck, it was the beginning of a discovery no one had anticipated. curious fluids and invisible weapons? Intrigued, Fleming repeated the experiment deliberately this time. He tested his own saliva, tears, nasal mucus, and skin secretions. In each case, a similar effect occurred. Certain bacteria were destroyed, while others were unaffected. His first hypothesis: was this an immune reaction, an enzyme, a salt imbalance? Over weeks, he tested sample after sample, varying concentrations and conditions. Eventually, he isolated the active substancy of protein-based enzyme naturally present in human secretions. He named it lysozyme. This enzyme broke down bacterial cell walls, especially in non-pathogenic bacteria. It wasn't strong enough to kill the most dangerous pathogens like Streptococcus or Staphylococcus, but it was enough to reveal something radical. The human body could defend itself chemically, not just with white blood cells. This was a revolutionary idea at the time. Until then, immunity was largely understood as a function of cells phagocytes, lymphocytes, and blood components that engulfed and attacked invaders. Fleming had shown that natural antimicrobial chemicals existed within our own tissues, and fluid sand, they acted rapidly, selectively, and invisibly. He had, in essence, discovered one of the first natural antibiotic 7 if it wasn't yet strong enough to cure disease. The academic response: quiet applause. Fleming published his findings in a 1,922 paper titled "On a Remarkable Bacteriolytic Element Found in Tissues and Secretions." The response was mild. A few scientists showed interest. Some repeated the experiments. But the larger medical community remained indifferent. Why? Because lysozyme, though fascinating, wasn't immediately useful in treatment. It worked best on non-pathogenic bacteria and was difficult to isolate in therapeutic quantities. In a world still obsessed with antiseptics and vaccines, it was seen as a scientific curiosity, not a clinical solution. But to Fleming, it was a philosophical turning point. It validated what he had seen during the war, that the body had ways of healing itself if supported properly, and that chemicals could be designed or found that worked in harmony with human biology, not against it. Lysozyme had opened a new window into how medicine could fight infection with precision rather than blunt force. And that lesson, seemingly forgotten by others, remained firmly lodged in Fleming's mind. Beyond the Petri dish, a new framework, in the years following the lysozyme discovery, Fleming's lab became a quiet ground for unconventional thinking. He remained committed to bacteriology, but with a refined lens. Instead of merely cataloging pathogens, he now explored how bacteria interacted with their environments, how they responded to heat, to pH, to immune substances. He tracked mutations, patterns of resistance, and survival strategies. More importantly, he began to wonder, if one such natural chemical exists in the body, could there be others? Could nature be hiding stronger agents, molecules, enzymes, or secretions capable of killing even the most virulent microbes? And if so, how would we recognize them? This question drove Fleming into years of meticulous experimentation, often yielding no results, often ending in frustration. But he persisted, trusting that answers hide in what others overlook. His lysozyme discovery may not have cured anyone, but it prepared his mind for what was coming next, the unseen step toward penicillin. It's tempting to see penicillin as a bolt of lightning, a one-time flash of luck, but science rarely works that way. Fleming's discovery of lysozyme laid the mental and methodological groundwork for the discovery of penicillin 6 years later. It taught him to look at contamination not as failure, but as opportunity. It taught him that natural substances could be powerful defenders against infection. It taught him to trust his eyes, to observe patiently, and to chase the unexpected. Most importantly, it taught him that the answer may not lie in synthetic chemicals or harsh acids, but in something growing quietly under our noses, waiting to be noticed. Lysozyme may not have changed the world, but it changed Fleming, and that made all the difference. Chapter 5. The Mold That Changed the World. It was a cool morning in September 1928 when Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to his cluttered laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital. Dust floated in the early light. The air smelled faintly of agar and ink. The building was nearly silent, except for the distant tap of footsteps in the hallway. On his workbench sat a row of forgotten petri dishes, left unattended while he had been away. Most were covered in thick films of bacterial colonies, Staphylococcus aureus, one of the more common but dangerous strains he often studied. But one dish was different. In that dish, something extraordinary had happened. At the edge of the bacterial smear, a patch of green-blue mold had taken hold. Around it, the staph bacteria had disappeared, leaving a clear Ringa halo of emptiness where once there was thriving infection. Fleming leaned in, his eyes narrowed. Not contamination, not coincidence. Something powerful was happening. The accidental discovery. Most scientists would have discarded the dish. After all, contamination was common, especially in a lab as notoriously untidy as Fleming's. But he didn't throw it away. Instead, he turned the dish under the light, examined it from multiple angles, and made the most important observation of his career. The mold appears to be releasing a substance that kills the bacteria. He isolated the mold and identified it as a strain of Penicillium notatum, a relative of the fungi that grow on bread. It wasn't new molds like it had been studied for decades. But no one had taken it this far. No one had noticed this effect. Fleming began testing the mold's secretions. In dish after dish, he watched harmful bacteria dissolve around the mold. Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Gonococcusal, highly dangerous organisms succumbed to this invisible weapon. More astonishingly, it did not harm white blood cells or human tissue. It was a selective killer, a bacterial assassin leaving human cells untouched. He named the substance penicillin after the mold that produced it, testing the limits. The next weeks were spent in near isolation. Fleming worked late into the evenings, growing more of the mold, filtering its extract, testing it on different bacteria. He sketched notes furiously, sometimes on the backs of envelopes, sometimes on stray lab reports. He tried infecting lab animals and treating them with penicillin broth, but ran into a frustrating challenge. The substance was unstable. It broke down rapidly, especially in heat. It was difficult to isolate in large amounts and even harder to store or inject reliably. Still, he persisted. In 1929, he published his results in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology under the modest title, On the Antibacterial Action of Cultures of a Penicillium, with special reference to their use in the isolation of B. influenzae. The paper was quiet. It didn't make headlines. No scientific revolution erupted overnight. Other researchers skimmed over it, intrigued but unconvinced. Why? Because penicillin, though potent, seemed too unstable for clinical use. There were no tools yet to extract, purify, and preserve it effectively. But Fleming never doubted its significance. When I woke up just after dawn on the 28th of September, 1928, he later recalled, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionize all medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic, but I guess that's exactly what I did. A discovery in the shadows. For most of the 1930s, Fleming's discovery of penicillin sat idle. He continued to mention it in lectures and write occasional follow-ups, but there was no rush of support, no rush of funding. His lab lacked the chemical expertise to extract and stabilize penicillin for human use. He was a bacteriologist, not a chemist, and knew his limits. Many scientists and doctors remained unaware or uninterested. The world had not yet caught up with the moldy petri dish. But Fleming kept the cultures alive. He kept the notes. He kept the dream. He once confided to a colleague, "One day someone will see what this really is. One day they'll know it was here all along." That day was coming, and it would come not from London but from Oxford, waiting for the world to listen. The 1930s were a time of rising political storms. Hitler rose in Germany. Civil wars raged in Europe. In science, researchers pursued vaccines, serums, and chemotherapy agents with growing urgency. Meanwhile, Fleming continued to work at St. Mary's, not in glory, but in obscurity. He kept experimenting. He trained students. He watched. He waited. And though he did not know it yet, in 1938, a full decade after his discovery, a group of scientists at the University of Oxford, led by Howard Florey, Ernst Boris Chain, and Norman Heatley, stumbled upon his 1,929 paper, and this time someone looked twice. They would take penicillin further than Fleming ever could, scaling it into a treatment, testing it on humans, and eventually changing the course of World War II and modern medicine forever. But none of it could have happened without the man who noticed the mold, who kept the dish, and who never dismissed what others called an accident. Fleming had done his part. The torch was now passed. Chapter 6. The Road to Penicillin. The year was 1938. 10 years had passed since Alexander Fleming quietly published his discovery of penicillin, and the world had moved on facing economic depression, political extremism, and the looming specter of war. But in Oxford, in a modest lab within the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology, a small group of scientists were looking for a miracle. Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, with a calm demeanor and relentless focus, had long been interested in the chemistry of infection. His team included Ernst Boris Chain, a brilliant but temperamental Jewish-German biochemist who had fled Nazi persecution, and Norman Heatley, a creative and practical biologist with an engineer's mind. They were looking for natural substances that could kill bacteriae, preferably those not yet resisted by existing treatments like sulfa drugs. During their research, Chain stumbled upon a little-known paper from 1929 by a man named Alexander Fleming on the antibacterial action of cultures of a penicillium. They read it, then they read it again. They were astounded, breathing life into a forgotten discovery. What intrigued Florey and Chain wasn't just the paper's findings, it was the fact that no one had followed up. Here was a substance that could destroy harmful bacteria without harming human cells, and it had been sitting in obscurity for a decade. The Oxford team set to work immediately. They obtained a sample of the Penicillium notatum mold from St. Mary's still preserved thanks to Fleming's foresight, and began trying to isolate and purify the active ingredient. This was not easy. Penicillin was highly unstable. It decomposed in heat, broke down in light, and was difficult to extract in any usable quantity. Chain's first attempts failed. Heatley devised a new method, using bedpans, milk churns, and even ceramic baths as fermentation vessels. The lab began to smell faintly of mushrooms and vinegar. It was science by improvisation, and it worked. By 1940, they had produced enough penicillin to begin animal trials. They infected mice with deadly doses of streptococcus, then treated half with penicillin. The untreated mice died. The treated mice survived. It was a breakthrough. The first human trial. In early 1941, the team was ready to try penicillin on a human. The patient was Albert Alexander, a 43-year-old police officer with a severe infection in his face caused by a scratch from a rosebush. The infection had spread rapidly, and he was near death. They administered penicillin. Within hours, he began to improve. His fever dropped, the swelling reduced, his breathing stabilized. But tragedy struck. The team had only been able to produce a small amount of penicillin, barely enough for a few days. When their supply ran out, Albert Alexander relapsed and died. Still, the implications were clear. Penicillin worked. It could save lives if it could be mass-produced. That became their next mission, a wartime effort. With World War II escalating, the British government saw penicillin as a strategic weapon not of destruction, but of healing. The U.S. was brought into the effort. American pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, and others joined the race. Scientists in the U.S. began growing penicillin in deep tanks, discovering that a strain from a moldy cantaloupe in Peoria, Illinois, was especially potent. It became the new global standard. Production ramped up. By 1943, penicillin was being distributed to Allied troops in North Africa and Italy. By 1944, just in time for day enough had been made to supply every Allied soldier in the field. The effects were revolutionary. Infections that once killed thousands after surgery now became treatable. Amputations declined. Deaths from battlefield wounds plummeted. Penicillin didn't just save lives, it changed how war medicine was practiced. And in the background, quietly watching, was Alexander Fleming, still working in his modest lab, still humble, still astonished by how far his discovery had come. Fleming rejoins the story. Though he had not been involved in the Oxford development effort, Fleming was never bitter. In fact, he praised the Oxford team at every opportunity, stating, "Without Florey and Chain, I could never have taken penicillin to the bedside." Still, the world soon realized where it all began. Reporters dug up the original paper. Fleming's photo began appearing in magazines. Honors began pouring ink knighthood in 1944, and soon something even greater. In 1945, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to Fleming, Florey, and Chain, honoring not just the initial discovery, but the entire journey from moldy petri dish to global lifesaver. At the Nobel ceremony in Stockholm, Fleming stepped to the podium and issued a warning. The time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant. It was a prophecy. But for now, penicillin was a miracle, and its messenger was a quiet man who once looked twice at a moldy dish and saw the future. Chapter 7. A Revolution in Medicine. By 1945, penicillin was no longer an experimentat, was a world-changing force. In hospitals across Europe and North America, doctors were witnessing what had once seemed impossible, patients recovering from infections that had previously meant certain death. A child with bacterial pneumonia once, doomed to slip into unconsciousness and die now, sat up within days of receiving penicillin. A woman recovering from postnatal sepsis, a condition that once claimed mothers by the thousands, now walked out of the ward holding her newborn baby. For the first time, modern medicine had a weapon not just to contain infections, but to cure them swiftly, safely, and with near universal applicability. The age of antibiotics had arrived, and the face of medicine changed forever. Hospitals transformed. Before penicillin, even routine surgeries were fraught with risk. Amputation, dental extractions, tonsillectomies all carried the chance of fatal infections, like Staphylococcus aureus or Streptococcus pyogenes. Doctors had learned to treat wounds with caution, to sterilize instruments carefully, but the outcomes were still uncertain. Infection was a constant, invisible threat. Penicillin changed that. Surgeries became safer. Burn patients survived. Bacterial endocarditis, meningitis, syphilis all suddenly treatable. By 1946, mass production of penicillin had brought prices down. What was once an experimental drug reserved for soldiers and royalty became available in hospitals across the globe. It was a democratization of healing, and it lifted medicine into a new era of capability. For Alexander Fleming, it was more than success. It was vindication. He had never imagined the reach of that green mold from his bench in Paddington, and yet, day by day, it was proving more powerful than anyone had dared to hope. a model for future antibiotics. As penicillin's triumph grew, so did interest in finding more antibiotics. Pharmaceutical companies and government labs launched massive research programs to discover other bacteria-killing substances, especially from soil microbes and fungi. These new antibiotics, streptomycin, chloramphenicol, tetracycline, erythromycin, were discovered in rapid succession. This became known as the Golden Age of antibiotics, spanning from the late 1940s through the 1960s. Each new drug added to medicine's arsenal. Streptomycin cured tuberculosis. Chloramphenicol fought typhoid and meningitis. Tetracycline treated a broad spectrum of respiratory and intestinal infections. But all of them owed their path to the trail Fleming had blazed. His method of observation, culture testing, and commitment to natural microbial agents became the foundation for antibiotic development protocols across the scientific world. Penicillin was no longer just a drug, it was a blueprint. The global impact. Penicillin didn't just change hospitals, it changed civilization. In developing countries, death rates from common infections plummeted. Child mortality dropped. Life expectancy rose dramatically. Epidemics of diseases like scarlet fever, syphilis, and rheumatic fever were tamed. By the mid-1950s, penicillin was being produced by the ton and distributed by the vial across continents. In places with no access to modern medicine, a single injection of penicillin became a symbol of hope. In some villages, the penicillin doctor became a legendary figure, part physician, part miracle worker. Public health campaigns taught people to recognize symptoms and seek antibiotics early. A new culture of proactive medicine emerged. Governments built infrastructure around antibiotic distribution. Doctors gained confidence in treating infections that had long eluded cure. Surgical procedures advanced faster, knowing infection control was finally reliable. The world was healthier, safer, and more optimistic than it had been in centuries. And it all traced back to a man who had simply watched, wondered, and waited. The man behind the miracle? As penicillin conquered disease, Alexander Fleming became a legend. He received accolades from scientific societies, universities, kings, and presidents. Time magazine named him one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century. Streets and schools were named after him. Statues were erected. Yet through it all, Fleming remained modest. He refused to patent penicillin. He accepted no royalties. He insisted the discovery belonged to humanity, not to him. He continued working at St. Mary's Hospital, still dressed in modest tweeds, still keeping his cluttered lab bench, still arriving early and staying late. Journalists came from around the world. Students requested interviews. But Fleming always gave the same message. I didn't invent penicillin, nature did. I only discovered it by not throwing something away. And that perhaps more than anything was the essence of the revolution. That sometimes the greatest changes in history begin not with force, but with quiet attention, patient thought, and the courage to wonder what others ignore. Chapter 8. Global Recognition and Nobel Glory. By the end of the 1940s, Alexander Fleming had become a household name. The man who once worked in quiet obscurity now found himself in the spotlight of international fame. In Britain, he was hailed as a national Treasurer scientific knight who had helped win the war without firing a single bullet. In the United States, magazines called him the man who defeated infection. In hospitals across the world, nurses whispered his name to patients who owed him their lives. He had never sought attention, and yet now he was the most celebrated scientist on earth. The quiet Scot from Lockfield had become a symbol not just of medical discovery, but of humility, hope, and the power of curiosity. A knighthood and a warning. In 1944, Alexander Fleming received one of Britain's highest honors. He was knighted by King George VI at Buckingham Palace, becoming Sir Alexander Fleming. Photographs from that day show a modest man in a formal coat, slightly uncomfortable in the public gaze, bowing before royalty with grace but little fanfare. He smiled only briefly, and his eyes, even in that moment of glory, seemed distracted as if still thinking about petri dishes and bacterial strains. But Sir Alexander was not just a hero. He was also a voice of caution. As newspapers celebrated the miracle of penicillin, Fleming spoke softly, firmly, about responsibility. Penicillin is not a panacea. It is not a cure-all. It is a tool, and, like any tool, it must be used wisely. In speeches across Europe and America, he warned about the danger of underuse and misuse. If you use too little, you teach the microbe to resist. If you use too much, you may harm the body or create a superbug. Respect penicillin, or we may lose it. These were not just theoretical warnings. He had already observed cases where bacteria began adapting, developing resistance to the very drug that had been their nemesis. Most of the public did not fully understand, but Fleming saw what was coming. He always did. The Nobel Prize? In 1945, the recognition became official. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded jointly to Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Boris Chaina Rare Trio Award, recognizing both the discovery of penicillin and its development into a usable treatment. Fleming traveled to Stockholm, Sweden, to receive the prize. In the Grand Hall of the Swedish Academy, beneath chandeliers and murals of laureates past, he delivered a speech not of triumph, but of balance. I would like to share this honor with the humble mold which gave me the idea, and with the millions who will never know my name but will feel the effects of its gift. Florey and Chain also spoke, emphasizing the teamwork and global cooperation that had brought penicillin from dish to drug. But it was Fleming's quiet humility that captured the world's attention. Newsreels played his image. Journalists wrote profiles of the man who watched mold grow. He received honorary degrees from Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, Paris, Berlin, and Rome. He met heads of state, religious leaders, and kings. But to those who knew him best, he never changed. Fame and the everyday. Despite his growing status, Fleming continued working in his small lab at St. Mary's Hospital. Tourists sometimes stood outside the door hoping for a glimpse. Colleagues teased him about the attention, but Fleming stayed rooted. He wore the same rumpled suits, ate in the hospital cafeteria, took public transportation. Often, when asked why he hadn't written a memoir or started a foundation, he simply replied, "I still have things to study. Discovery never stops." His marriage to Sarah Marion McElroy, his Irish-born nurse wife, remained strong until her passing in 1949. After her death, he threw himself deeper into his work, teaching students, giving lectures, and consulting on research projects across Europe. When asked about his growing list of awards and accolades, he shrugged. "I didn't invent penicillin. Nature made it. I just noticed." That phrase would appear on plaques, posters, and textbooks for decades to come. The philosopher of penicillin. In the years that followed, Fleming became more than a scientist, became a philosopher of medicine. He gave speeches not just about penicillin, but about the ethics of discovery, the responsibility of knowledge, and the duty of scientists to remain humble. He warned against scientific arrogance, reminding audiences that great breakthroughs often came from quiet moments and unlikely sources. He encouraged young researchers to listen to nature, to be patient, to make time for mistakes. A dish left out, a drop of mold. That is how it began, he would say, but only because I looked again. Fleming became a mentor to generations of bacteriologists. Many of the greatest discoveries in mid-20th century medicine vaccines, other antibiotics, antivirals emerged from labs inspired by his quiet style and steady vision. And yet, he never stopped reminding the world that his was a discovery of chance, elevated by observation and secured by discipline. Chapter 9. Legacy of a Quiet Genius. The late 1940s and early 1950s were a time of rapid transformation. The world, still recovering from war, was embracing a new future jet planes, atomic energy, televised broadcasts, and medical marvels. In this future, one name stood quietly among the headlines: Alexander Fleming. He was not flamboyant, not political, not even particularly social, yet his influence was profound. Every child saved from pneumonia, every mother cured of infection, every wound healed without amputation, these were the echoes of his discovery. He had not invented a device, he had not written a constitution, but he had done something that shifted the odds in humanity's favor permanently. He had turned the tide in the age-old war between man and microbe. The scientific legacy. In the decades following the rise of penicillin, the field of antibiotics exploded. Inspired by Fleming's methods, researchers began hunting for other microbial agents in soil, fungi, and marine organisms. The antibiotics that followed, streptomycin, vancomycin, neomycin, rifampicin, and more, took on the most vicious diseases of the 20th century. In many ways, Fleming had not just discovered a drug, he had created a new disciplinia philosophy of biological combat, where medicine could selectively kill invading organisms without harming the host. Medical schools restructured their training, hospitals redesigned their treatment protocols, pharmaceutical companies created entire divisions dedicated to antibiotic research. Even surgical procedures advanced, as doctors now operated with far lower infection risk. Chemotherapy, organ transplants, dental surgery made possible or safer by antibiotics. Fleming's methods, empirical observation, careful culture control, and relentless curiosity became part of the scientific canon, and his story, repeated in classrooms across the world, became a parable of modern science. Chance favors the prepared mind. The ethical voice. Beyond his scientific contributions, Fleming left a profound ethical legacy. From the moment penicillin became mass-produced, he refused to patent the discovery. He never profited from it, despite the fact that it could have made him enormously wealthy. He believed that life-saving medicine belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford it. In public speeches, he often warned, "We must not let science become the servant of profit. It must remain the servant of life." His humility stood in contrast to many rising pharmaceutical executives of the post-war years. Where they saw opportunity, Fleming saw responsibility. He also remained vocal about antibiotic resistance, even when few others understood the threat. "If we continue using penicillin improperly," he warned, "we will educate bacteria to defeat it. We must never underestimate nature's ability to fight back." These early warnings were eerily prescient. In the decades after his death, resistant strains of staph, gonorrhea, and tuberculosis would begin to emerge. Today, his warnings form the foundation of global campaigns about antibiotic stewardship, a personal life of simplicity. Despite global recognition, Fleming never lost his sense of self. He continued living modestly. He never hired secretaries or assistants to answer his mail. He often replied to student letters himself in precise handwriting with encouraging words. After his first wife, Sarah, passed away in 1949, he married Amalia Koutsuri-Voreka, a Greek physician and researcher. Their relationship was warm, grounded in mutual respect, and gave Fleming new emotional strength in his later years. He continued working at St. Mary's Hospital, often arriving early and staying late. Visitors were often surprised to find the world's most famous scientist cleaning test tubes himself. When asked why he never moved into a larger lab or sought a professorship at Oxford or Cambridge, he answered simply, "This is where the mold grew. This is where I belong." Even as his health began to decline, he kept his daily routines, lecturing and mentoring until nearly the end of his life. The final years and farewell. On the 11th of March, 1955, Alexander Fleming died suddenly of a heart attack at his London home. He was 73 years old. News of his death spread across the world. In Paris, London, New York, and Tokyo, newspapers ran headlines like "The Man Who Saved Millions" and "The Quiet Hero of Modern Medicine." Governments sent tributes. Universities held vigils. Hospitals across the world lowered their flags. He was buried with full honors at St. Paul's Cathedral, among Britain's greatest heroes. His tombstone was simple, bearing only his name, birth and death dates, and the words, "Discoverer of Penicillin." No monument, however, could fully capture what he had done. His legacy lives on not just in scientific journals, not just in museum exhibits or classroom stories, but in the living bodies of those who survived because of him. Every bottle of antibiotics, every clean surgical scar, every child who smiles after recovering from strep throat, Fleming is there. Chapter 10. What if Fleming hadn't looked twice? The story of Alexander Fleming is often told as a tale of luck. A mold spore drifts through the air, lands on a petri dish, and changes the world. But luck is only part of the truth. What happened in that small lab in St. Mary's was more than just an accident. It was the collision of chance with a prepared mind. Because the real question is not what happened, but what might have happened if Alexander Fleming had not looked twice. The forgotten dishes of history. Science is filled with moments like Fleming's unplanned, unscheduled, unintended. A bubbling liquid, a sudden color change, a dish left in a corner. Most of these moments are missed. Why? Because they happen when no one is watching, or worse, when someone is watching but not noticing. Fleming's genius wasn't just that he had the mold. It was that he saw something unusual and he asked why. Why were the bacteria receding? What was the mold doing? Could this be something more? Had he dismissed it as contamination? Had he cleaned the dish without hesitation? Had he failed to connect what he saw with what he knew? The world would have gone on unchanged, but also unhealed. The millions who never knew. We often measure great discoveries by the awards they receive or the institutions they change, but Fleming's discovery is better measured in lives unknowingly saved. The soldier who didn't lose his leg, the child whose fever broke just in time. The mother who held her baby instead of a funeral program. Most of them never knew his name. They never read his paper. They never saw the mold, but they were his legacy, every bit as much as the Nobel Prize or the statue in St. Paul's Planet. And that legacy has only grown. Today, antibiotics remain one of the few inventions that touch nearly every human on Earth. Across continents, cultures, languages, and generations, his work continues, quietly, powerfully, every time someone gets well from an infection that once meant death. The thin thread of scientific progress. It's tempting to think that if Fleming hadn't discovered penicillin, someone else would have, and perhaps eventually they would have. But in science, timing matters. So does context. So does vision. Would someone have noticed the mold in time to save lives during WWII? Would penicillin have been developed fast enough to treat wound infections on day? Would the world have entered the age of antibiotics in 1928 or 1958? Even small delays in discovery can cost millions of lives. Fleming's story is a reminder that the thread of progress is fragile even not by inevitability, but by individual attention, by minds willing to wonder, and by people who choose to ask, "What if?" instead of walking away. The true power of a prepared mind. Fleming's greatness did not lie in his laboratory, or his title, or his fame. It lay in his eye-sin, his willingness to see what others would ignore. It lay in his discipline in years of careful testing, even when no one else believed in what he saw. It lay in his humility in sharing the discovery freely, in not claiming more credit than he deserved. It lay in his vision and understanding that the smallest biological agent could save the largest number of lives, and that is his final gift, not penicillin alone, but a reminder to every scientist, student, and thinker. The next great breakthrough might already be growing unnoticed on a bench, in a dish, in a quiet corner. The difference will come not from brilliance alone, but from the one who chooses to look again. Because sometimes changing the world starts with not throwing something away.